for the for the third try. All right, nothing crashed yet. So, hey, okay, we should be live now. It might take a second for it to pop up on my YouTube feed, but yeah. Sorry about that, ladies and gentlemen. Technical difficulties, and also I had to catch a game, as I was telling David here off air. And yeah, sorry for the delay, and hopefully we can give you a good show today. And yeah, how's your day been though, David? Before we start.
Yeah, it's been pretty busy so far this morning. Beautiful sunny day with intermittent heavy cloud rolling over, and pretty breezy and pretty cold outside for a change. Yesterday it was stinking hot and storms, so yeah. Well, we get there. How are you going?
I'm good. Yeah. Well, to be honest, after the humiliating loss that my team suffered, yeah. But other than that, I'm feeling all right, to be honest. But yeah, have you been playing anything new as of late, or?
So I am playing at the moment. I'm still working my way through Dave the Diver. That game is addictive as hell. And I've put some hours into Judgment, the Yakuza spin-off game. I'm quite enjoying that actually. Familiar settings, because I'm a big fan of the Yakuza series. Familiar settings, some familiar gameplay items, and some new parts to it which make it a bit interesting, and the storyline's pretty cool too. So yeah, how about yourself?
I've actually just started playing that Epic Mickey Rebrushed, which I'm actually a pretty big fan of. Epic Mickey. I didn't play the original Wii version, but I fell in love with it just from like watching YouTube videos of it as a kid, because it's Mickey Mouse, and you can never really go wrong with him too much. Of course, if you deviate away from the source material, but the game is actually pretty good. I don't know if you ever played that Alice in Wonderland type of game. It was.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of like that, where it has more horror-esque like art to it. But for the most part, it's a fun little platformer, a collectathon mostly, but it's really fun.
You're right.
Yeah.
Cool.
I actually do.
Had the son's been asking me about that.
Oh, well, now you have someone that has some knowledge of the game.
Absolutely.
Yeah, go get it for your kid.
That's good.
I think you could play it multiplayer. I might be wrong. Don't quote me on that.
It'll be interesting if you can. Certainly be putting some eyes on that now.
Yeah, you play with your kid. Why don't you?
Yeah. Oh, definitely.
Yeah. So I know we're a bit late on this topic here, because it's already been like 2 weeks now since this subject first came out. But I kind of wanted to tackle it as soon as like the information kind of died down and we had every source of information we could, and like what's actually going on. So yeah, but so originally when I shared the information with you kind of like were questioning it, which was interesting. So
in the chat, in our
yeah,
in the chat groups we were in, yeah,
regarding like what's actually happening in Japan, at least.
Yeah, and I know I was a little bit short at times, but I appreciate that you took it in good faith, because it certainly wasn't me having a go at you. There were a few people on Twitter that certainly I was having a go at for their stupidity. But yeah, there's this guidance material that came out in the last 6 to 12 months around how foreign investment and to get into Japanese companies, investing in Japanese companies that are traded and not traded, and then how they want companies within Japan to work with each other or to engage with each other for buyouts and whatnot. And Japan's always been a difficult one for the Western world to invest in, or anyone outside of Japan to invest in, because they've got very particular customs and say social norms and that sort of stuff from their business world. And you can quite quickly offend someone if you don't do things in a particular way or in a particular manner. So the Trade Department, or the Investment Commission, Japanese Investment Commission, released their guidance material. It's quite extensive if you're a nerd like me and read through the whole thing. It's quite detailed on what particular things need to happen and when and what's expected, but it's not actual law. It's more of a, these are the laws and this is how we expect you to work within those laws. But the challenge is always, if you're doing an internal acquisition within Japan, it's not too difficult. They are all aware of who needs to do what and whatnot because they're all working in the same culture. But for foreigners coming in, in American and European, and some African countries, Middle Eastern countries, they just rock up with a big heap of cash and go, I'm buying you, and there's nothing you can do about it. Well, in Japan, you can't do that. You've got to be respectfully asking if they want to be acquired, and then there's a process they need to go through. So the company that's asking to do the buying, the company that's being asked to be bought out, they've got different requirements and whatnot. And then they've got to go through, if they're listed on the Tokyo Stock Exchange, they've got to get that approval there. They've got to make public notices, they've got to make public announcements, they've got to have share trading halts and all that sort of stuff, and bits and pieces go on there. And then they've got to get a permission from, so they've got to get approval from the Tokyo Stock Exchange, and they've got to get permission from the Japan's Fair Trading Commission. And then once they've gotten approval from those two, if it's a foreign body that's doing the investing or there's any control of the company's going to be held outside of Japan, it goes through their security investment review process. Is the company a national tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, depending on which tier it's in as to how much foreign investment it can have. And then once they get through that, they've got to go through the Japanese Foreign Investment Review Board and Commission and get the approval there. And then once you've jumped through those 5 major hoops, you get all the way up to the Japanese finance minister can just knock it on the head and say, no, I don't like this because of I don't like this. And once the minister says no, that's it. The whole deal is kaput. So there's still an awful lot of regulation for any company to jump through if they want to follow that guidance and actually get through that process of acquiring a Japanese company. Having said all that, they can show up to the Tokyo Stock Exchange and just start buying shares, but they can't.
Yeah, shares are public, so I wouldn't expect those to be restricted, right?
Well, they're not restricted by trade volume or anything like that at the stock exchange, but the companies themselves have minimum and maximum allowable ownership amounts for, say, domestic and international investment, or bodies, individuals, or institutions, and there's limits on voting power. So even if you're buying shares above and beyond what your limits are, you're capped at 15% of the voting power. So you can dilute other people's ability to vote, but in terms of the share volume, but it will only charge up the non-institutional investors' ability to hold their voting percentage rights. So, and some companies will dictate that no one person can have more than 10% or 12% or 15% or whatever it is of the voting power, which is why you see, like the conversation we've got with Kadokawa and Sony. They've got commonality across shareholders, not the institutional ones. So if the Bank of Japan owns a fair chunk of Sony and owns a fair chunk of Kadokawa, then there's no dilution of voting rights if one buys the other, but there is a concentration of voting rights, which will trigger an issue within those 5 different regulatory bodies I just mentioned before. So there's limitations that are imposed within the Corporations Act, what would normally be referred to as the Corporations Act in Australia or the Company Act in America. There's limitations on who can have how much in a publicly traded company. But, if that South Korean mob decided to show up and try and buy all the shares off the stock exchange, they could. It would cost them an absolute fortune above and beyond what it'd be worth, but then they would also get triggered by, it would trigger a share trading halt in a review, and then potentially they'd just have it taken back off them by the Japanese government, and they could quite easily just not they could pay all that money and then get fined and not get any of that money back.
Real quick, just want to address the chat. Shout out to everyone because there's a lot of people watching. Shout out to Retro. See you in the chat, you smug prick. I see you gloating about your team victory. Also, shout out to Craig. Shout out to William. I see some of your points. Pretty interesting. How you're pointing it. But I always kind of thought that like when buying shares, I didn't think it was like impossible for outside companies to, of course, acquire more of voting power. I think the one example I know the most about was the Disney example when some stock trader was buying out their shares, trying to control the company. But I wasn't too sure how that worked. So is it different for each country then, like in terms of how that works?
Not only is it different for each country, it's different for each exchange and different for each legislation that covers the exchange. So, for example, in America, you got New York Stock Exchange, you got NYSE Stock Exchange, which is the major one where the S&P 500 sits.
Yeah.
But then you've got the Nasdaq, that sits in a different exchange with a different set of rules. And then you've got the Chicago Futures Board, different state, different set of rules. That being mostly commodities based, that's got a hugely different set of regulations across it. If Texas does finally get their stock exchange up, and so they've got a state one, but if they decide to take it global, like they're being pushed to do, and it wouldn't surprise me if they did in the next 12 to 18 months, they again would have a totally different rule set. Australia's only got one major, which is the Australian Stock Exchange based out of Sydney, but we've got two other minor stock exchanges for domestically floated companies. We've got one out of Melbourne and one out of Canberra. And they're there for vastly different reasons. You got the London Stock Exchange. Singapore's got two.
I get the gist of it. Each country,
domestic.
Each country has their own. Yeah. So in terms of the Japanese one though, it would be restrictive for like Kakao to buy any more of the shares from Kadokawa, right? Is basically what you're saying.
Yeah, and the other thing too is it's Singapore based company. It's also got rules and regulations on how much it can own of a foreign entity. So the South Korean Stock Exchange and the South Korean investment boards and all that sort of stuff. It's not necessarily, Japan will have rules about how much money can come in. South Korea will have how much money can go out. And noting that most Asian countries have very strict rules about how much money can go out of their country and be invested in overseas areas. Mainly because if there's a conflict or if there's an issue, they can't nationalize those companies. And that sounds odd to a Western society, but it
doesn't sound that quite odd to me actually, because I've read up quite a bit of history about like oil companies that have been nationalized over the years.
Yeah. It'd be like, if something happens, the US ends up in a conflict and all of a sudden they nationalize Microsoft.
Yeah.
Microsoft becomes a government agency, and everything is owned by the government and controlled by whoever's in charge at that point. It's more common for it to be more widespread in Asian countries than it is in, say, Western OECD countries. But they've all got different rules and different regulations, and for various different reasons. But there's awful lot of turmoil on the Korean Peninsula at the moment in what's supposed to be the more stable of the two countries that exist on that little block of land, and trying to get money out of the country. China went through this in the big rush from 2008 to 2016. They were pouring dollars and dollars out of China into other countries and investing it in land and housing and agriculture and fixed assets to try and wash it all through because it was coming out of their black market. And then they put all this money tracing stuff in place and restrictions on that to try and stem the bleeding coming out of China. That they had trillions of dollars flood out of that country.
I will say though, this buyout does kind of come at an interesting point in time though when it comes to the Japanese stock market, because like right now their economy is kind of like, it's been stagnant for a long time. Like I want to say like 20, maybe like more so years, right? That they've been stagnant.
Yeah.
So
yes, but they measure things in a different manner. So their level of stagnant, it's almost non-comparable to what America or Australia or the UK has in terms of theirs, because they don't look after their inflation rate through cash interest rates. They look after their inflation rate through bond futures, and so they manipulate their forward bond markets to work their economic growth. And they've been, say, flatlined on their inflation number for a long time, except for when everything peaked with COVID. But they're back down to a low level now. But their inflation number is not reflective of their GPD or some of their other indicators. And they tend to be doing really, like, you see companies are giving pay rises you say it's in a tough economic condition, but they're still giving pay rises because the foreign exchange rates and that are providing cash flow benefit for them. But if you go like for like in terms of inflation or economic growth, they are been crawling at a snail's pace since the mid 80s. Where we'll go 3 or 4% in a really, really good year. They'll go 0.5% and call it a good year.
Yeah. Also, Ghost of Shadow in the chat asking a good question. So basically, the reason I wanted to bring up the cacao thing first was because so you kind of shot that down with the idea of like a foreign company being able to buy out the shares and control Kadokawa that way. So would you think that this sell had more to do with like Kadokawa's stocks more so like kind of falling down from its controversies and a big hack that happened?
Yeah, I mean that impact. Well, the impact that cybersecurity issue had in the last 6 to 9 months ago now, the flow on from that is it really didn't impact their share price too much. But the news about this purchase certainly made their share price jump. Ridiculous high amount. Having said that, like they're not just gaming. Obviously, they got massive publishing, media publishing, print publishing.
No, like other Japanese companies, they're really well diverse, almost too diverse to be honest.
Yeah. To a degree, they are. They're not too dissimilar to Bandai and Namco in that they've got media publishing, anime publishing, print media. They got contracts with the government for producing learning and educational materials, printing, mass printing, and all that sort of stuff. So, and they're very unique in that respect. The Korean company that owns a fair chunk of them, and potentially trying to acquire them completely. They can't really pick it up and take it out of country, and without those contracts, it's not really worth much. But yeah, the threat of the buyout, and asking one of their current not even a major shareholder, but their current shareholders to increase their holding to not dilute that voting thing, as I mentioned before. It's not an unusual conversation in most traded companies. They'll reach out to their key stakeholders and say, hey, this is potentially in the wind, and we've got to let you know that this is what's, conversations are happening over here and over there. And that media release that they put out in response to, media story pops up, Sony's going to buy Kadokawa, it's imminent. 2 sources at Sony have confirmed this. The stock price just jumps nearly 50%. It's up 55% over the last 1 month. And naturally, the stock exchange is going to go, oi, there's something going on here. And it may be that someone's just leaked that story because they want to trade out of it and get a benefit. But as soon as the stock exchange says something's wrong here, because the media is reporting this and none of the companies have said either, then Kadokawa releases a statement that's effectively says, we've been approached by a shareholder to talk about their shareholdings, and we have not made a decision about that yet. We're still in discussions, and we'll let you know when time comes. That was a month ago, and all the media reported it was imminent, hours or days away, that Sony was going to do a full buyout of this thing. Congratulations to those who jumped on it and ran with it, because clearly, it's very evident that they know nothing about how acquisitions work or how the communications need to happen. Because as soon as someone's serious about it, they've got to tell the market. and there hasn't been a word said about it. So there'll be a
lost track of for words there.
sorry, hang on a sec.
You're good. But it's kind of interesting though, because like I would assume that the stocks would go down similar to what happened with Paramount when they announced that Sony was entering the bid to buy them, because of course everyone saw their stocks rose, of course, but stocks were still dropping because of how their performance was. But I would assume the same would happen to Kadokawa though, so their stocks wouldn't stay as high as they were when this was announced. So that would still kind of put them back to where they were before this. Still kind of doing just okay. Nothing too spectacular.
Well, they're now trading at, let me just have a quick squeeze here, sorry. They're trading at their highest point by a long way in the last 5 years. They're up nearly 400% compared to this time 5 years ago. And when the announcement was made, they were trading at an average price at the best that they'd ever been for a long time. So this notion that they're, back in early October, they were trading at one of the highest that they had ever been in history since they got onto the market. So now they're trading at the high, like they're 50% up on that. It's insane how high they're trading now. But share market price, so their market capitalization, is a reflection of their ability to generate cash flow and revenue and future cash flows, not just current cash flows. So it's curious, and as you say, when Sony and Apollo Capital were in looking at getting Paramount, and their share price was in free fall at the time, it's understandable because they just were leaking and bleeding money left, right, and center. Sony was getting in on that deal to try and support Apollo in buying it, and Sony being, we've got the knowledge and expertise around how you need to operate in this heavily regulated field, so that you can at least be showing up with some level of expertise backing you to say, yes, we want to buy it. Whereas if Apollo showed up on its own and said, hey, we're going to buy this thing, we've got no clue about operating in this landscape or in this industry, from a regulatory perspective and all the rest of it, the chances of the regulators signing off and saying, yeah, you can do that, zero.
No. Yeah, I'm aware. I'm aware. Especially with the rules that the government has with the when it comes to the, I forgot what it's called, but practically like the CBS's, all those big news stations here in the US, those are always going to be protected by the government. So yeah, that's right. So, and sorry, that's not me preaching to you. That's for those that are listening that are wondering why Sony would go in a partnership arrangement. It's just for that reason. Apollo was stumping up all the cash. Sony was just showing up to provide the support and then get paid out later. But I mean, this thing with Kadokawa and Sony fronting up or being the one that was nominated. Now, it may be that it was simply just the general, we've got a foreign investor that's looking to do something, they want to increase their shareholdings, and we've got to talk to everyone. Could be as simple as that. Because the comments that were made in that press release from Kadokawa to the market just said someone's approached us in looking at increasing their shareholdings. And we haven't made a decision either way. Right.
And it never identified who it was, but the fact that the share price jumped so much upon that news that Sony was the one who was going to do it, instantly the market as the market said, there's something's not right here. And anyone in their right mind who operates any of these companies, who is very knowledgeable, because the people that run these things aren't idiots. They've got huge amounts of knowledge and experience, and they deal with so many moving parts, it's not funny to make most people's heads spin. If they tried to do anything, the second the stock price went through the roof off those media releases, if they tried to do anything, even people that have got shares in Kadokawa dumped a heap of them to try and benefit from it, there would be an investigation, insider trading, faster than your head could spin. be insane how fast they would jump on whoever it was. And as soon as one person gets jumped on for it, the whole lot get dragged into it. So, yeah. Congratulations to the media for running a story that's probably put a heap of people's livelihoods at risk. I'm surprised, though, that the share price hasn't dropped, but...
that's probably because some people were expecting the sale to go through, though. Some people were probably expecting to get some big money from this.
One would suspect, but the volume of trades has dropped off, so the price is staying up pretty high. Yeah, they've got a pretty low dividend yield as well. It's not too bad for a Japanese company, but...
What's interesting about Kadokawa to me is the fact that the main company itself doesn't really make a lot of the revenue from what I've studied. Apparently, FromSoft actually has outdone them in terms of revenue. So,
FromSoft generates about a third of the total revenue for the whole group.
Yeah. Well, just last year, because I saw like the company's report from a video that I was looking for more information on, and apparently they reported that Kadokawa actually made less than FromSoft whenever Elden Ring came out. It wasn't last year. It was probably 2 years ago now. Yeah.
Oh, that would be if you broke it down into its subgroups, then that's potentially the case. But if you're looking at it as consolidated, you will inevitably get the offsetting. So if something will be revenue in FromSoft, then it'll be an expense in Kadokawa. And when you start going through and cutting those eliminations out, you actually get back to the real, like the actual uninflated point. It's very, well, I'd say it'd be very difficult. Sorry, I'll rephrase that. If FromSoft was outperforming its parent company, then the parent company would effectively be having more expenditure that would be offsetting what's coming out of FromSoft than what FromSoft's generating, and by deductive reasoning, FromSoft should be shut down because it's costing more than it's worth. But we know that that's not the case.
Yeah.
But again, it's depending on how you, because I haven't seen that video, sorry, but depending on how you're slicing up and reviewing it, yeah. But so the security breach didn't make a massive impact on their shareholdings, but the success of Elden Ring's DLC, that may be the reasoning for driving it up. Or
I mean, I would assume that at least like when their former CEO left the company, I would have like at least guessed that like at least some shareholders probably would have lost faith in the company after that, because you don't really recover too fast after losing a CEO.
Yeah, it's well, it depends on a number of things there as to whether we've actually seen the fallout from it or not. I don't think we have, because they haven't said to us what the fallout's going to be. They've just said this was the impact of our sales and this is what it's cost us and our operating profit and whatnot. But the forecast is not saying, they're upping their revised forecast in terms of their net sales, but their ordinary profit and their operating profit is down big bickies. They're down 20%. So it's going to have an impact, but the share price hasn't dropped since that information came out, which suggests that the shareholders are currently not too concerned about that. The earnings per share are certainly going to go down,
right?
But we're talking about movements in a forecast and 6 months out from it. Yeah, it's an interesting and very clunky report to read through if you look through their second quarter report. But it's not too bad. I mean, it's the gaming segment's performing quite well. It's the other segments that are going to drag it down.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, it would be not difficult for something to pop up that would bring the share price back down. But while the share price is inflated at that rate, it does help ward off a hostile takeover attempt. But yeah, it's certainly not it's not a company or a group that you would be looking at and rubbing your hands together as the person buying it, going, hey, yeah, I'm going to get a cash cow here, because
I mean, unless you're a Sony, of course, because they have more to gain from like the anime and gaming segments alone.
That's true, but the outlay is going to be, I've got to pay a premium to buy it, and then I'm liable as the new owner for all the what's yet to flow out of this cybersecurity issue, which could end up being...
Interesting you say that. Now, of course, I linked you. Of course, I told you about that other YouTuber, which I know you said that you dislike, so I'm not going to name him here, just out of courtesy, of course. But he made the point that because he always promotes himself that he has like done like mergers and acquisitions before in law, so he stated that the share price that it is right now, due to the boost from the announcement, that shouldn't be the share price that they were negotiating. So I don't know if that's true or not, but I know right now they would be more of a premium than they were before. But
there's always a spike when it gets announced. There's always a spike because it'll spike it up to whatever the announced amount would be. But there's no announcement.
Yeah.
The fact that there's been no announcement suggests that either company or both companies aren't sitting there doing at that level of negotiation yet, because the rules are, particularly in Japan, the rules are, as soon as you approach with the intent, you have to tell the market. You have to tell the market. We get told minutes after these partnership arrangements that happen in Japan get signed. The second that they say we're entering talks, we are officially entering talks to acquire or be engaged with or provide partnership or whatever with, when they bought a stake in FromSoft, they told us the day that they agreed to doing it. They've got like 48 hours to tell the market that they're doing it, and they can't just rush the deal through again because of these regulatory points. So if the issue is that the share price is now jumped up, and it's, it happens when these things go. If the share price has jumped up to the premium that Sony reportedly or allegedly is going to pay for it, and the market has not been told a single word of this, we're not talking about a slap on the wrist repercussions. We're talking about the boss of Sony going to jail for this shit. Like the boss of Kadokawa going to jail for this stuff. They don't muck around in Japan with corporate law breaking. They will throw people in jail for years and years and years, because they don't take this shit lightly. Again, the fact that nothing's been announced,
aside from the letter, of course, the letter of intent, but
yeah, apart from the letter from Kadokawa, who they had to issue that letter because they were told there's an investigation, that they were notified of a unusual trading and an investigation there. Now, it may be that the Korean companies made that announcement because they found out that they couldn't buy Kadokawa and they're about to dump the stock in it. They're just looking for other institutional buyers to pick it up. It might be that's the case, but that's between the shareholders themselves, and Kadokawa's got nothing to do with that. Because the instruction will come from the board, and the board represents the shareholders, and if the shareholders say no, that's it. Simple as that. But if the shareholders say, yeah, sure, we'll buy them out and we'll just part it up, then that's fine. But the legal side, like the litigation side to come out of that cybersecurity breach, if Sony or whoever it is that's buying this, so there's, the shareholders have got to wear that. But if Sony buys them outright through a full acquisition, Sony's then on the hook for that.
Right.
They've got to fund those payouts. Now, if you're paying a premium that's 50% more than what their market trading share was at the time, and then you're also at risk of having to pay, we'll do it in dollars, so US dollars, we're talking tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars in penalties and payouts and civil suits and all the rest of that, because there was high school information that was breached. Why would you go and buy that problem? You wouldn't. You just take one look at it and you go, you know what? We're fine as we are, thanks. We might modify our holdings if we have to protect our interests, but Tencent's got some stake in this. Sony's got some stake in this. You've got, Bank of Japan and a heap of other institutional investors have got some stake in this. It's stable. It's not got a cash flow issue. It's not got a performance issue that we need to worry about. It's still able to be self-sufficient. We're just going to sit back and wait and see what flows down the pipeline in terms of potential penalties or litigation or anything like that. And at that point, when you know what the outcome's going to be, then you would make the moves to go and proceed with an acquisition or a partial share holding improvement or whatever it is. But protecting against a foreign investment buyout right now just seems nonsensical. If someone from South Korea wants to own the whole thing because they can't pick it up and take it away, if they want to pay the stupid premium for it and pay out the rest of them, well, fine. But they're also then going to be on the hook for this massive amount of impacts from the cybersecurity litigation. I don't think the South Korean company's too keen on that either. And it may be that the original thing was, instead of trying to ward off, because Kadokawa has never said anything publicly about trying to ward off.
Yeah, of course, it's all rumors still.
It is. Yeah. So remember, 12 months ago, Sony was buying Bandai Namco, and it was a done deal. Like 3 years ago, Microsoft was buying Sega. It was going to be announced that day. It's a slow news week, and someone just goes, "Oh, I've got 2 sources, anonymous sources out of Sony who know exactly what's happening." It's like, yeah, really? Because the people who make this decision would not talk about this outside of a closed room that has no ears in it. Be about a dozen people at most across both companies who would know that these talks are going on, and they're not going to say anything. They're not going to give up the millions and millions of dollars that they would lose by getting fired for it. Like,
to be fair, at least there is some credibility there, around this buyout. At least since the Bloomberg article came out that Sony has been in talks with Kadokawa before. So, and Bloomberg isn't no tabloid machine, really. At least
it depends on who's writing it. I would go and say Bloomberg's. They've got some runs on the board in that they've called things correctly, but they've called about the same amount incorrectly, and it depends on who's writing the article. But yeah, you're right. Sony talks to Kadokawa all the time. They're a major partner of Sony. Kadokawa gets pulled along to their partner events. They get pulled along to their corporate events. They'd be in touch with each other a couple of times a month. They operate in similar circles. They have massive amounts of partnership bits and pieces going on. And it's not unusual for these large companies to just say, hey, you're up for an acquisition, you're up for a buyout, what price would you want? 2 or 3 times a year, that would be about the norm. I've worked in companies that do that all the time. And all of a sudden you'll get, oh yeah, no, we would be interested at this point, or we'd be interested at that point. But beyond asking a question of, are you interested, and then proceeding on to, let's talk about doing it, that's when the market has to be told. But up until that point, it's challenging when these articles come out to take them seriously. No one reported Sony buying Bungie until the day that it was being announced.
Right, but there was also the what's it called? I always forget their name. The Leu, that Hong Kong company too, that was announced by articles. Wasn't really talked about by Sony all too much though, but Leu did sell to Tencent, and it was reported that it was a battle between Tencent and Sony that wanted that company. So it's not too rare. It's not too rare, but it does happen somewhat.
Yeah. Some of the outcomes of those things though are who wants to stump up the cash and who's going to take the secondary point and just go in with a partnership supply arrangement. And Sony pulled out of buying Fox at 76 billion, and Disney got it for just over 80 billion when all the I's were dotted and T's were crossed and all the rest of it. So it's I don't know. It's where do you perceive value? And that bidding war started at 60 billion. When it got to 76, and Sony went, "No, that's it. We're out. Too much." That wasn't public knowledge until they'd gotten started on it. But then that was Disney buys Fox, and then Sony gets access to some of that stuff because they had to divest a heap of stuff. But these sort of bidding wars usually happen in the back office. They know what they're doing. They get professional negotiators in to do this stuff, and they know what their limits are. It's not like buying a house where you might stretch yourself 50, 60, 80 grand beyond what you can do, and then you try and scratch the rest of it together and negotiate the final outcome. These guys know what they're doing. But yeah, I just find it funny. I do find it humorous that for something that was such a sure thing and a done deal nearly a month ago,
It hasn't been
the
that
only
long
thing with
yet, I believe. I think it was.
It's
I
been
think
4 weeks.
Yeah, close to a month.
So,
But again, these deals do tend to take their time, though. To be fair, even if something is announced.
Yeah, they do. But no announcement means anything that happens in terms of a deal will get slaughtered by the regulators, and people will end up in big trouble. So
Not necessarily, unless like Kadokawa, of course, is like waiting for other bidders or talking to other companies behind the scenes too, which they could very well be doing.
They still need to announce to the market that they're up for they're doing that.
Right.
Otherwise, they'll get in trouble. So,
although I don't think it was like announced like with all the companies that were in talks with Paramount though, either, because there were several.
Yeah, but that's a different regulator, different market set, different.
All right, I'm just kind of using that as as something to compare it to.
Yeah, it's the Paramount thing is a disaster waiting to happen when it did or does happen. But yeah, but
I'm waiting
right,
for that thing to crash and burn.
That does highlight the difference in, as we said when we started the show. There's a very different requirements and different aspects to doing these things in Japan, and said person that will remain nameless may have a lot of experience doing mergers and acquisitions in their domestic environment, but when you're dealing with Asian countries, particularly Japan and South Korea and Vietnam, it's very much you've got to follow their culture. They don't care who you are, and China is streets and streets ahead of that in terms of, quick anecdote, was working on a project where it had Chinese investment, and it was staged at different points depending on milestones, and I got invited along or asked to come along to one of the meetings, and it was in person, and the project manager said, you make sure you're clean shaven, make sure you've had your hair cut that morning, and make sure you've had your nails done. I said, what do you mean, had my nails done? And he goes, yeah, no joke, make sure you've gone and gotten your nails trimmed and make sure they look right, because this particular individual from China who's got billions and billions of dollars that they want to invest in these things, and when you shake his hand, he looks at your nails and sees that your nails are unkept, he will not trust you with his money. You must be able to look after yourself and be very presentable to put across first impressions that this person is, that you're able to look after this person's investment. Because if you don't look after yourself, how could you look after anything else? Like, that's insane. Business deals hanging off whether I've had my nails done.
Real quick, just want to address the Ghost Shadow's comment there. Typically, these big kind of deals with these big companies don't really go too fast. They kind of tend to take their time. I mean, look at all the other acquisitions that have happened in the past few years. Microsoft and Activision being the biggest one that lasted for a very, very long time. Of course. So
the speed of the deal depends on how many regulators have to be involved.
Right.
And I don't believe. My perspective is if they're buying out the parent company, and it depends on how the deal's being done too. If they're going to buy the whole thing and consolidate, or if they're just buying out controlling shares or 100% of the shares in the parent company.
Yeah, that's kind of the speculation right now of like what's actually going to happen, because I know for a fact that Sony wouldn't want every aspect of Kadokawa, because like they don't really have uses for everything.
No, there's stuff that they would want, there's stuff that they wouldn't. It's either an all or nothing, or you can just invest in them to protect your partnership deals. Sony and Tencent and Sony and NetEase have got so many joint funding. Like, they both own equal shares in Epic. They both own shares to a degree in all the Japanese publishers now, and they own parts of some of the other key studios. Like, they own parts of FromSoft, but they also own shares in Kadokawa, and they own parts of indirect investments in Ubisoft and some of the different studios around that. It's all a matter of they will invest where they see benefit. Some of these investments we'll give you the money to do X, Y, Z, and instead of us giving it to you as a loan, we will just say it's a capital investment. You give us some shares, and then if we want to move on, we can sell the shares and go and do something else, or you buy the shares back from us once the deal's finished. So many different ways of funding things, and different ways of doing it. So, you know, if this deal goes through and it is a genuine offer, and we find out that it has been a genuine offer made at some point to seriously consider this, because at the moment it doesn't seem like it's going to progress beyond speculation. But if they did go down that pathway, because the commonality amongst majority of shareholders between Sony and Kadokawa, and it's the same with all the other Japanese publishers and Nintendo included, they may not pay a single cent for this thing. They may just do it as a share swap offering. And Sony's the other day just announced that they finished their major program of share buybacks. So they've got a crap load of shares sitting up their sleeve that they could issue. They might just do that. And if you're issuing shares instead of cash, there's an entirely new, particularly in Japan, there's an entirely new set of regulations that they've got to go through, because they've got to issue new shares.
Yeah, Sony's done that before too. I believe they did it with the Lei, where they offered a mix of both cash and shares.
Yeah. Typically, you say it's this many shares based on that value, and we cash settle the difference for the partial shares, because that's the most neatest way of doing it. But again, it depends. Are they buying shares in the parent company to just leave it alone, or are they going to acquire the whole thing, pay out all outstanding shares, and absorb it? If you do that, then you have to pay cash, because you can't just issue shares to cover that, because there's ultimately issues around that. There's so many permutations about what may or may not happen here because of how they're structured. But it's not like Sony, and it may not be that PlayStation is the one who gets it. It may be that Sony Pictures or Sony Music gets this thing, because that's where all the anime sits, in Sony Music. It doesn't sit in Sony Pictures or Sony TV.
Right.
And what would music want with physical media publishing?
I believe it wouldn't be music. Well, it would be Sony Japan Music, I believe. Which is its own completely different segment, of course.
Yes, that's correct.
And I believe Kadokawa does dabble in like the Japanese music industry. I believe they do more or so live performances, when I read about them.
Yeah, they're not completely outside of doing that sort of stuff, particularly in support of their animation or their anime pieces.
That's where I see like that kind of falling in line for at least the Japanese side of Sony.
Yeah, but that's a very specific market segment too. Yes,
of course,
there's a huge audience there, but
so is like the manga industry too as well, since it's like more physical media related, which is in itself in its own niche little bubble, of course.
Oh, absolutely. And therein lies the next, I suppose, the dichotomy between, does a foreign investor go in and grab it, or does someone internally grab it, or does it just stay how it is? Because there's nothing wrong with the Kadokawa as it is. Square Enix is the one of the Japanese six that is the most at risk. and it's the most at risk because it's the most diversified globally. They had to sell off their entire Western division just to be able to try and sort their shit out, so to speak, and then try and relaunch again from there. But Kadokawa was financially sound, it's structurally sound, and it's got a very solid revenue base to continue on from. Yes, they've got some cost problems, they've got some potential litigation issues, but they're not in a world of hurt. But also, if Kakao decided to jump in from South Korea, buy the whole thing, they're not going to exit them from the Japanese market because that's where most of their revenue is coming from.
Yeah.
And yeah, FromSoft when they launched Elden Ring, massive amount of revenue spike for that. FromSoft launches the DLC, massive revenue spike for that. Outside of those two things, in the years when FromSoft isn't doing anything, something's got to pay the bills to keep the lights on. That's what the rest of the organization does. And let's not forget that they also had, between the two, the Elden Ring and the Elden Ring DLC, they launched, what was that, Mecha Armored Core? Was that Armored Core 6? That thing wasn't a massive hit, but it wasn't a flop either. That generated a decent chunk of revenue for them. They've got publishing deals with anime tie-ins, and they don't. Just that's actually with everyone. So.
That's actually what I wanted to jump into too, because I've been kind of catching up on more of the anime industry and how that's doing, and apparently licensing costs have gone up quite a bit since Sony bought Crunchyroll now, and so I believe the cost of that also goes up when it comes to producing anime, since in this industry, I believe a lot of the Japanese companies like to split in terms of how they fund these projects. So that's why you always see a tie, like some sort of agreement with Bandai doing the video games, either Sony producing a bit of the anime, and then you have the manga publishers that of course do the books as well.
Yeah, that's right.
What I find interesting too is Sony themselves are kind of trying to cut any costs they can, and I believe this is manga is the only one that they kind of need where they can control the IP as well too, and they won't have to pay anybody for that either.
Yeah, it's there's always this fascination with owning IP, and if you're a publisher that owns your own IP, there's inevitably a larger cost associated with that.
Right.
And Kadokawa was quite a nimble and quite a trimmed down corporate structure to go with that as well. If it landed up in with Sony, it's then got to contribute to that monster overhead, and it's got to contribute to being able to support those IP and development. And when you're competing for funding against things that have got nothing to do with that at all, you're at the risk of getting things not happening. And that's where, we're not talking about funding for gaming versus funding for gaming. We're talking about funding for gaming versus funding for an anime IP. And if put this out there just as a talking point example, if it was to happen, Sony picked these guys up, whole thing happens, everyone's all in one nice big little bubble. And they're sitting there going, we're going to invest in either the next Last of Us game, or we're going to invest in Sergeant Frog's next anime push. Which one do you think would win? Because Sergeant Frog's got a much bigger fan base than The Last of Us, and Sergeant Frog can potentially produce more revenue for them than The Last of Us can.
I would think one segment wouldn't affect the other per se, because of course Sony's always operated in its different groups kind of get different amounts of funding, of course. So
that's true, but that's what I mean. If you've got Sony's as a broader group's got a finite amount of funding that goes into each division.
Yeah.
And if you're saying we can do this or we can do that, when you get down to it may be that that's the case that they get to, because it does happen now. There's stuff happening in the anime section where they go, we want to own and generate and be involved with more IP, and we can own the IP, but we've got to develop and maintain that IP. Well, that costs money. Well, music needs more money to fund this next project, so we're going to pull it out of games and we're going to transfer it over to music, because they're not. That's the issue with this corporate. You pay back to corporate, and corporate redistributes all this project funding. That's where the R&D stuff comes in. So PlayStation doesn't get to keep all the money it makes.
Oh yeah.
It has to pay a fair chunk of that back as R&D. That's why their R&D is so huge, and that's why their average cost of capital is so high. They're paying it back into the slush fund that then gets redistributed elsewhere. If PlayStation was able to keep all the money it generated, it probably wouldn't have half the stuff you get out of. You wouldn't have Crunchyroll and Aniplex to begin with, but Sony Music wouldn't have half the stuff it's got.
Oh no, yeah, and they make a lot of purchases too.
Yeah, films and TV would just be hanging on by the skin of its teeth. But then, Sony makes so much money out of their distribution network, and rather than owning the IP, because it's hands off. The creation of, like we see with their gaming studios, generating an IP and producing the stuff costs a ton of money, whereas just being the distribution partner and having that network available, you can charge you're the publisher, or you can charge the studio that's trying to distribute this thing the fees for it and then collect on the back end. It's a far more lucrative engagement, even though it might not be sizable in terms of dollars. It's certainly sizable in terms of turnover and the percentage you get out of it, and the inputs are a lot less. So not that I disagree with a lot of the things that you're saying. I see there's a lot of benefits here for it. But
the only reason I bring it up too is because, like, you can see Sony clearly wants us to push for more IP. They're borrowing more IP for PlayStation to put into their film division, and they, of course, when they came to the Paramount, they were talking about like what it would benefit them in terms of owning all that IP. So I think this is an IP push itself for Kadokawa as well. If they could get this deal like further along, but
absolutely. Absolutely. And
I do get your point though, that it is risky, because funding all these projects and like doing so much and like diverse, like, because not all the money goes into one corporation, like you said. So it's like it's gonna be very like tight in terms of funding. So
yeah, and that's always the challenge. You've got a finite amount of funding and resources, and you've got competing projects or competing items. As soon as you start stacking them up and you look at the key performance metrics requirements, the end result is what's going to be the best outcome for the organization in terms of being able to reinvest in the future. And when you get to those marginal ones that cost an awful lot to make, the risk of them not performing to hit those targets, they're the ones that start falling down the list really quickly. And the ones that don't cost a lot to make, that have the much more potential upside, end up the top. Now, it's, forgive the terminology, but it's arse about face to think that something like The Last of Us 4 is going to lose out to Sergeant Frog. Sergeant Frog, it's got a huge supporter base, and it's an ongoing piece that can be split out into a mobile game, a console game, if you wanted to, a movie, an adaptation, and an ongoing anime piece that's going to draw people into a subscription service. That's got far more upside on the revenue piece because it's low cost input, whereas The Last of Us Volume 3 is going to cost 200 plus million, potentially more, to make. It's likely going to be a hit, but it's also got other issues associated with it. To meet that same percentage margin, it would have to sell through 8 or 10 million in the first 6 months. The chance of that happening, well, it's not as much of a clear-cut thing as what The Last of Us Volume 2 was, or Part 2 was. That's the stuff that these guys get paid to risk. They get paid to make these decisions, and when the decisions are right, they get the bonuses, and when the decisions are wrong, they get sucked. And you've got to put a lot of faith in your underlings that they're telling you the actual truth, because if someone stuffs the numbers up by putting a decimal point in the wrong spot, you could make some serious issues and end up with a heap of people being laid off because it didn't perform.
Yeah, I could understand that. Gotta always be accurate with the math, anytime, anywhere. So yeah, especially with the amount of heads that Kadokawa has too. It wouldn't be easy to keep all those heads and still like try to get like the profit that you need from it.
Yeah, that's right. So the publication and IP creation is That's the for Kadokawa, that's their baseline. It's usually between 5 and 5.5 billion yen every quarter. Billion? Yeah. Animation and film sits between 3 and 4-ish. Gaming, when something hasn't been released, gaming is about 1.5 billion yen. It's when you get big launches. So I'm just looking at since the Q1 2023, which would be the June quarter in 2023. So there's a massive jump in the second quarter just gone in 2024. So that would have been that was the quarter when Elden Ring's DLC released, and the jump from the previous year went from 1.6 billion yen to 7.2 billion yen. That's the impact that Elden Ring has, just on a DLC, had to their gaming segment. When they don't have a game launch or they don't have a major title doing, that kind of number, it's barely, what are we at, 6, 12, it's like 2/12, 1/6 of their revenue stream comes from their gaming segment. And that's across the world.
Sorry, trying to address someone in chat there, but
No, you're right. But Kadokawa also operates an online high school and online university.
yeah, that's kind of, they operate a lot of different things that really kind of wouldn't make sense for Sony to keep. I think like if that purchase did go through, they would probably like spin off all those other assets into their own company at very least.
But that's the important point that I'm having a very horrible time explaining clearly, and I apologize for this. They spun off all that other stuff, and it would be gone. They would have to, what underpins Kadokawa is its publication, its IP creation, and its animation and film. Without FromSoft and Spike Chunksoft having those outputs, they're just spikes. And their gaming segment relies on their publication and animation stuff to just continue on what it's doing. And that's why, if Sony, like you said, Sony bought it, it wouldn't be PlayStation that gets it. It would be music that gets it, because that's where all this stuff sits in Sony. Yeah. But if they spun out the online university and they spun out the publication piece, they would pretty much halve the baseline of what they get out of that publication work. That would deteriorate the ability to generate revenue. And then when you add this massive corporate overhead on top of it, I would actually be surprised if this thing survived in the Sony corporate structure. Unless they brought it in and spun all the they brought it in and said, here's Sony anime or Sony publication and anime, and spun the anime stuff out of music and over into this, and just set it up as its own new division. Then maybe I could see that making more sense, but that's a huge amount of cost associated with that as well.
Yeah, I could see that. But the interesting thing too that came out, like, not like, I want to say 2 weeks ago, was like some articles coming out saying that Kadokawa was kind of like hinting that they wanted to be sold as a whole company, not just just sell parts of the company. So I don't know how the heads would feel about like Sony like splitting off the portions they didn't want after the buyout. You would think that they would
it'd have to be disclosed, and then so this is where I think it gets funny, and I say funny, this gets amusing to me. If I sold you something, the second that I've sold it to you, you can do whatever you like with it, right? If I sold you something and said, I'm selling this to you, but you can't carve it up, why would you buy it if you can't do what you want to do with it?
Yeah.
Like, as soon
and
as
that was actually kind of
my point.
That was actually kind of the handicap that was with the Paramount thing, because Terry Redstone wanted Paramount to stay together.
Yeah, it's like, so I don't want it. I want to sell it to you because I want the money, but you can't do all these things with it.
Yeah.
Well, fair enough that the person who's in these situations, if you're selling it and someone's buying it, someone should be aware of what's going to happen with it. That's what the regulators are for. That's their job. And like them or hate them, that's what they're supposed to do. Now, some regulators do a good job, some regulators do a horrible job. You know, case in point, the last 18 months. But if you're going to say Kadokawa only wants to be sold and kept held together, well, if the person buying it wants to carve it up, well, that's their prerogative, isn't it? The only thing the regulators should be concerned about is, well, if you're going to carve it up, are we talking job losses? Are we talking potential issues around laws being broken? What are we talking about here? And the consolidation of ownership over things is never necessarily a good thing. The main exception is if a company is failing and failing miserably because they can't do anything to save themselves. So it's really horrible leadership, and the shareholders don't realize, the board don't realize that. Then selling to someone who knows what the hell they're doing is a sensible thing to do. But I'm not seeing that when I'm reading these reports from Kadokawa.
Yeah.
They got, you know,
it's interesting, and I don't know if the story will continue for like you think, but if it does, then I don't know. I think it'll be interesting to see where Sony sees the actual performance in the company and see what parts they cut out if this like acquisition does go through, because that would kind of show like us like what their actual intentions are for like what they're acquiring. Because it could be very well be that they just want those those specific portions, and they're just don't want to buy the rest. But if Kadokawa is just telling them, no, we want you to buy the whole thing, then Sony will probably just back out if they don't think it's like worth like what they're spending.
Well, that's the other thing. Yeah, you've hit it completely on the head there. Is what's their appetite for buying? Sony's going through an internal corporate restructure and a heap of other stuff to try and get rid of their dead wood and clear out their bloat from a corporate point. For exactly as I said, the corporate overhead is ridiculously constrictive at the moment at Sony, and they need to trim it up. That's what Jim Ryan wasn't able to do with PlayStation in finalising that consolidation of the 3 different areas into one unit. That stuff, and Hiroki Totoki, from not a PlayStation level but from a Sony level, is doing that across music, movies, TV, PlayStation gaming and network service, all the rest of it. They're working through spinning out their a part of their financial services, their banking division, into its own standalone unit to have more flexibility around doing stuff with that. Now, whether they hold that or they sell it off, I don't know yet. And no one really seems to know. Bank of Japan doesn't want them to sell it off. They want to keep it there, and Sony would be mad to get rid of having a banking division, but there's some regulatory stuff there that may restrict them from doing it. They're going through a massive structuring point there. To then go and grab an entire new company, massive multi-divisional company, and try and bring that in to the turmoil that's already going on, it'd have to be a very, very good deal to warrant that kind of headache. And at the moment, price doesn't, if the share price is indicative, that ain't a good deal.
Yeah.
But at the old share price before it spiked,
it probably
then
was.
We're getting into the realms of it could have been a good deal depending on what they wanted. And it may, it may be that Kadokawa goes, you know what, we might just dump our gaming division, because that's really what PlayStation's interested in, and it's cyclical in terms of revenue generation for Kadokawa. It certainly chews up a lot of expenditure, though, to keep that thing running every year. But they don't want to get rid of it because they want to hold on to it. They'll, if PlayStation and Tencent are helping support the development of those games, Kadokawa's not chipping in 100% of it. PlayStation's not chipping in 100%, and Tencent's not chipping in 100%, but they're getting a benefit out of it. Why not? Why not continue on with what they're doing? So
that's a good question that I'm going to leave off there, because I kind of do want to share something else real quick.
That's fine,
because it is getting late, and I do kind of want to get your thoughts on this other topic. It wasn't part of the video, but I do want to get it because it is kind of currently breaking. But also, just to track back just a little bit, I don't think that the gaming division will go under PlayStation. I think it'll more so go under Sony Music, because they kind of want more games for their anime. So that's where I think it would fall. But
it would make sense. because
Yeah.
that's, as you said, that's where the anime Crunchyroll and Aniplex
Yeah.
and most of the mobile gaming studios that they're owned are over in Sony Music. Makes sense to put them there.
Yeah.
And it's
So I think that's what
all
will
in one
keep them.
place.
But
Yeah.
so change topics now, though. I did want to kind of get your thoughts on the whole current like Ubisoft stuff that's kind of broken out about that their stock has kind of tumbled more, where their own stockholders think that they should just go private. Which
Yeah, yeah, that one I think is a smart idea for Ubisoft. Mainly because the stock has had a nosedive. Because again, as I said earlier, the stock price is a reflection of the company's ability to generate future cash flows and earnings to the shareholders, right? And their stock has just gone down and down and down and down based off their abilities to generate revenue out of the assets. It's dropped off so far that they're going to struggle to get capital investment at a decent level to right the ship to a degree. But it's down to a point where the family might as well make it private, because then they can start making riskier decisions again. And it's not at the board controlled worrying about shareholders and them withholding money or driving, differences and whatnot. The institutional shareholders want to bail out, but they don't want to sell on the open market because they would have lost waste too much in their capital points. They obviously don't think it's going to recover back to the levels they want it to, so they'll want to get out at a premium rate.
Yeah, and that's the other thing too, is like similar to the Kadokawa thing, where their stock prices rose. Tencent's been rumored that they might step in and buy Ubisoft, which rose their stocks again a little bit. But
yeah,
the thing that's kind of interesting though is that the Guillemot family is the major controller of Ubisoft, so it'd be up to them if they want to sell or if they just want to maintain control, because they've been in control of Ubisoft from, I believe, the very beginning.
They set it up, owned it, and invested in it, and did all the rest of it.
And I believe like last year when the rumors broke out that they were selling before, that the Guillemot family wanted to, like, even if they did sell to Tencent, that they would want to still maintain control over it even under Tencent. I don't know what the possibility of that would be. So
the reports coming out of it are that Tencent is open to the conversation, and they're just waiting on the Guillemot family to basically Yves to make his decision. Yves obviously wants to maintain control because that's what he wants.
Yeah.
Whether they can get the funding together to do it will rely on how much Tencent is going to pay out. Now, Tencent's based, from my understanding, Tencent's saying, well, we'll chip in as much as you want us to chip in, but we want to have more of a say in the funding directions and in the performance outputs. And Yves is not someone who wants to give up any level of control at all. But the way the markets are over in France and some of the turmoil that's going on over there, I don't see a lot of money coming Ubisoft's way. Looking at where they're at, their share price at the moment, even though it took a big spike yesterday, out of the back of that confirmation that Tencent said, yeah, we're just waiting on them to make their decision and then we'll finalize the arrangements. The institutional investors, being BlackRock, Vanguard, T Price, all those big funds, hedge funds, and all the rest of it, they're going to get shot. They're reaping what they sow, because they all jumped in 2020 and 2021 when their share price was up around 70 to 82 euros, and yesterday when it's jumped, it's up to 13 euros. But that's about the same place it was in 2016, 2015, 2014, 2015. So it's not that it's completely dropped its ass. It's not the worst it's ever been. 2012 it was down at 5 euros, and it's had peaks and troughs before. But it's never going to hit the high it had in 2018, which when it went over 100 euros. But it's had better days.
Yeah, especially when you compare it to its competitors like EA, it hasn't performed as well either in terms of sales.
No, it hasn't, and that's we've been complaining about Ubisoft being rubbish to a degree. Like, they're not the worst. They're not bad. They always seem to be about 8/10 of what we want from them in their major titles. And like, look, here's a great example. We're talking about on Rap's show yesterday with X Defiant. It had 10 million players in the first 2 weeks. And the December of daily average was 320,000 players, and they've turned it off, saying it's too expensive to keep running. How many other free-to-play games have got 320,000 daily average players, and they say it's too expensive to run? Clearly, there's an issue there, and they've laid off 270, 300 people and redirected, shut down 2 studios and redirected another 300 or 400 people into other programs, mostly over to make sure Assassin's Creed Shadows works. But even that's a game that's coming out highly anticipated, that's got a heap of problems surrounding it, and shareholders and major partners are sitting there going, well, we're a bit nervous about the direction this is going. It would be more beneficial for them to be privately owned again, and even if it's with major funding from Tencent, owning 49%, or they own 51%, but they don't have 51% of the voting rights or whatever it is. And again, there's heaps of rules around investing in France if you're a foreign investor, and what you can and can't do, and voting share rights and limits and all that sort of stuff. So there's a heap of paperwork to be sorted out there. But this is one where the shareholders are saying, we want to sell. It's not the company saying we want to sell, and being someone approaching them. The shareholders are saying, we want to get out of this. We want to sell out of this. 15 euros a share will be fine, or whatever the number is. 16, 18 euros a share, whatever. We want out. It's a bargain for anyone to buy it, because its total value is 1.76 billion. And what do we have? 34% of it's already owned by between Tencent and the Gilmont family.
Yeah,
so,
somewhere around there.
We're down around the 1.2 billion to pay it out. If Tencent picks up 3/4 of that, but they don't get the voting rights, well, so be it. But if they take it private, they can make a lot more decisions, more flexible and more nimbly. Yes, it puts the power in someone's hands, but if it goes wrong, the shareholders aren't then having meetings, and the investors aren't having meetings screaming about, we think that's too risky, pull it back. We think that's too risky, pull it back. Because all they want to do is de-risk this thing back to vanilla and get as much money as they can for vanilla. Private, they can take the risks again. We can get back to getting those Assassin's Creed games, or we can get the Rainbow Six games, or the stuff that are a bit more edgier, that get a bit more risk-taking. Because Tencent will throw the money at it, and Ubisoft will back it, because that's what they can do, because the same people that gave us all those great games back 10, 12, 15 years ago are still there. They just can't do it because they're being hamstrung by rules and regulations around what the investors will allow.
Yeah. Also, I think William's in the same boat as you about them needing to cut off the bloat. So.
Yeah. Oh, they've currently, as it said, saying they've got nearly 18,700 employees. It's over 20,000 when you consider the main contractors that are, I'll call them hat contractors. They're labour hire or on short-term contracts, sitting in employee roles. You don't need 20,000 people to build those games and operate that area. They're going to have to carve a lot of people out.
That's always been the fear with like whoever was going to buy Ubisoft, if like they did get to this point, was the massive headcount that they have.
If someone wants to bankroll me, I'll go and buy them tomorrow for 1.8 billion or 2 billion, and I'll carve it out and make it profitable in a matter of minutes. You look at the financials and some of the detail of these things, you're just like, why do they have that? What a waste of time and effort. The downside to that is you're potentially saying we're going to sack 10,000 people. There's no regulator on the planet that's going to allow that.
Yeah. It's kind of a tricky thing to deal with, considering especially a lot of developers all over.
Exactly. But if you take it private and climb over that hurdle, it's not a very big hurdle. You privatize it again because the shareholders want to get out of it. So who's going to object? All the major voting power want it to happen. Just haggling over price. And then it's Tencent waiting to find out what Eves and co want to do. That could effectively be a done deal, and Ubisoft is private by March next year. That's a very real possibility. Then you can go and sack 10,000 people and no regulator can step in because it's a private company. You can do whatever the hell you like. Now, people will get pissed off about it, but what's the government going to do? France? Government's not going to step in and do anything. They can't. There's no regulator that says you can't do X, Y, Z. You can't sack people because it's not a publicly traded company. It's a completely private company.
I think
So you get around an awful lot of problems there.
I think the only developer that they can't do that to for legal reasons, I think it would be their Singapore. That would be the developers that made the Skull and Bones, because I think they had like some government agreements that like they would be making like however many so games, because the government gave them funding. That'd be the only
so
tricky one.
Well, and that's dependent on the national rules and whether they've got funding for other stuff. So 134 of the people who got sacked for XDefiant were in Sydney, Australia. They just shut down that studio. Just, no, you're all off. Shut you down. They have to pay them out. Like it's a minimum 4 weeks plus number of weeks per service for year service, and there's long service leave, and there's additional insurances and on costs and all that sort of stuff. And it may be that part of their arrangement is that they've now got to help fund them to find a new job. There will be costs associated. But the easiest way to generate a cash improvement to a business is to unload people, because it's immediate. Your next pay run, you're not paying, you have that big hump at the start, and then that's it. We're not having to pay for that anymore. Cancelling contracts and getting out of facilities, that's got a hump initial cost, but the ongoing is it's just money that stops going out the door. And cash is king. If you keep the cash in-house to pay for things that generate more cash, you've got to cut them off. But 20,000 people in a $1.8 billion company, that's insane. And it's I don't like saying this lightly, but from a business analyst and financial analyst perspective, if you cut 5,000 of them out, you will turn that from a $1.8 billion company to a $2.8 billion company overnight.
Well, I think the other strategy too would be like, I don't think they would need to cut everybody out. Of course, they would probably need to cut like quite a few hundred people out of their company. But I think the other route would be like stop making as many expensive games. Like your Star Wars Outlaws was a flop because of how much it costed to make. Skull and Bones, of course, costed several hundred millions, I believe. And yeah, just a lot of their bigger games that were flops because of like the financials it took to like just to pour money into it and just like not be successful. I think they just need to do kind of a turnaround and go to smaller games as a pitch. That way they're not risking as much money and they can still keep like some of their headcount at the very least.
Yeah. Or even just doing more in the publishing realm, because being a publisher doesn't cost you, or say it costs money, but it's not that massive amount of years of outlay for developing an IP and then hoping that it works. The Skull and Bones, it's the thing that's just really strange. Skull and Bones was a great idea based off Assassin's Creed Black Flag, and it had its positives and had its negatives. It would have just made more sense to go, let's do an upgraded version of Black Flag and release that, and now we'll do a Black Flag Volume 2 or whatever it is.
Well, that kind of goes back to the government thing that I mentioned with the Singapore, because like I guess kind of the deal was that they wanted new games, not established games.
Yeah,
so.
And but then that again is a great head scratching example. If the Singapore government was chipping in for the development and basically footing the bill to make sure that thing happened, then the sales tanked. Ubisoft was not going to be out of pocket unless they went, say, off script about it and decided to add a heap of stuff in, or it took longer than they thought and they ran out of money. But when you've got someone else funding, it's the same with Square and Final Fantasy Remake, Rebirth, and whatever the next one is. PlayStation's chipping in most of the budget for that. So Square's throwing plenty of firepower at it to make it, top shelf, because it's part of the arrangement with PlayStation. But it's not like it's costing Square a huge amount of money, because they're getting back funded for the expenditure on it anyway.
Right.
Skull and Bones had 80% of its budget covered by the Singaporean government. Now, obviously the Singapore government's expecting some kind of feedback from it. But if they're going to pull the pin on the next game, the consideration there is, well, if we've got to make game 2, 3, and 4, how much money have we got left out of this deal to make game 2, 3, and 4, or was it funded per game? If it was funded per game, you wouldn't shut it down. You just find a game that doesn't cost as much to make, which means stay away from live service. Just,
yeah.
I don't know. Wheel out Assassin's Creed Valhalla, the game engine and whatnot, reskin that and get a new story written, reuse the assets, and wheel out something that's, it's a new game, it's a new story, new characters, because that won't cost you a bomb to write, and just reuse the assets, and off you go. And you've made a $50 million game, and it doesn't have to be 80 hours, make it 40 hours, ticking the boxes, and you're going to end up in front. But, again, that's the sort of decisions that can be quickly made when you're private, and you don't have investors to worry about. If you've got investors to worry about, and you've got all these boards of governance and oversight and all this other crap, and you've all this reporting that needs to happen that just chews up the leadership time. I might have been talking about this on I was talking about this not on a show, but in a different context. If you've got all your smart people at the top do you want focused on delivering stuff, and all they're doing is worried about reporting to the board and worried about governance, then you're not getting the best out of them. Take them away. Either take the governance piece away, take the board stuff away, take the investment worries away, and all that reporting crap. Take that away and be privately owned, or startup, or depending on your level, or don't put your best developers and your best doers in a position where all they're doing is reporting. Hire someone in to do the reporting. Arrowhead boss figured that out really quickly after Helldivers 2 launched. He couldn't be the CEO and the COO at the same time. So they brought in a CEO to look after all that, dealing with boards and investors and Sony and all the rest of it, who's got experience in doing that crap, and he just said, I'm going to focus on the game. And since that decision was made, Helldivers 2 has improved out of sight. Because he went, I don't like doing this, I'd rather do that, and I'm not good at doing this. I don't want to be the upward side, I want to be the downward side, and looking down and making it happen. That's what Ubisoft needs to do. And the sooner they do that, the better it's going to be for us.
So I think, well, from my perspective of the whole company, I think that it all depends on how Assassin's Creed does for them. If it is successful, personally, I don't think it will be that success that they need. But I just want to end this off with getting your thoughts. Like, what do you see happening, like in terms of them going private or them selling? What's your personal view?
I think it's it's not a foregone conclusion, because it'll depend on whether Eves is what position the moon is and what direction the wind's blowing from and what he had for breakfast. But
I personally think that they might stay private, and because after the whole deal with Gameloft and that being stolen from them practically in the Gameloft family, I don't think they'll want to sell Ubisoft personally.
Well, I don't think they'll want to sell it. I think they will buy it back off the main thing is the institutional shareholders want out, and they've got 60-something% of the shares. They're close to 2/3 of the shares are owned by the institutional investors, and they want out. So they will have a number in mind that they all want to get out at, that they're agreeable on. And Tencent's keen to buy more shares. The only thing that they're haggling out over at the moment, for lack of a better way of putting it, is how much control does Eves get to keep compared to what Tencent wants.
Right.
And Tencent seem to be happy to just accept whatever it is. We'll get it private, and then we'll work it out later. And if that's where it's at, then the push from the shareholders to sell out, the institutional shareholders to sell out, I think we're probably looking at March to June next year. We'll likely have a very different looking ownership structure of Ubisoft. And I would be surprised if it drags on longer than that, because when institutional shareholders want to get out, if they can't get out at the price they want, they will just hit the dump button, and it'll completely crater the value of the share price for Ubisoft. And if that happens, Tencent will just start buying, and then the value of the investment for Eves will deteriorate to a point where it's worth nothing to them.
Right.
And that becomes a problem for a whole slate of different reasons. So, I'd be very surprised if Ubisoft is still, or Ubisoft Entertainment SA is still trading publicly at that point.
Do you think that they'll just go private then, and then determine what happens with their company from then? Okay.
I'd say it'll be a private partnership. So take the company private, and then it'll just be whatever arrangement they come to privately between Tencent and themselves. Because then they don't have to do all this reporting crap. They don't have to worry about all this regulatory stuff. And then it's just Tencent's involvement in being an investment into a private company within France. And it gives them so much more flexibility.
I personally hope that doesn't happen, because Tencent tends to push more for mobile games and live service games. So I really don't want Ubisoft to do that, because they've kind of been the beacon of single player games for the most part. But
well, again, I look back at XDefiant. It's a first person shooter, and that's a saturated market. It's a hugely saturated market. But 320,000 average daily users.
Yeah, but you kind of do have to take into account how much it took to probably build that game if it didn't meet the costs that it actually took to make it.
Well, that's the thing that I find curious in the reasoning they gave for the discontinuing of it. It's the ongoing cost of maintaining that game. It wasn't that we've not. They didn't say we failed to cover what it cost to build it. They said it's too costly to continue going. Like, either the 320,000 average daily users over the last 30 days and it's not like it's peaked and still going down. It's flatlined at around 320,000. If they're not paying for stuff, then that's an easy thing to solve. Find a way of monetizing, and if you lose 100,000, you still got 220,000 a day, which is 100k more than what most others have got. But if you're saying the ongoing cost of running this thing is too much, and you're just going to shut it down, you've got a blueprint there for a successful live service game. Or why wouldn't you just make the effort to trim it up and get it profitable? Because you've already built it and it's there. If you're shutting it down, you're basically pulling the plug on it and going, well, we don't think we can do this at all. So I would be very surprised if Tencent did jump in and say, hey, we want X, Y, Z. And that's probably what the discussion point is. Tencent wants this, Eves and the Gilmont family want that. Gamers will respond to whatever it is. Assassin's Creed Shadows is probably going to be the litmus test of if that thing succeeds, even though it's had a heap of people carrying on about it. And it's coming out in February, and then Ghost of Yotei is supposed to come out in March to June in that quarter. I think it's March, April. Very similar games. Obviously, you're not going to.
I don't think Yotei is going to affect it too much.
Over the head. I don't think it's going to affect it, but you don't want to be launching after it.
Yeah.
You want to get out.
Definitely not.
So, and that may be the point. So they get out in front of it in February, and then they get 6 to 8, maybe 12 weeks. Yep, people can get into it, enjoy it, play through it, and it's great. Awesome. If it does well, that may be the saving grace, so to speak. But if it doesn't do well, again, they've got the same problem ongoing. So
this is where I'm gonna probably leave it off here. Is that it's actually kind of funny, like looking at this from a fan perspective when it comes to Yoti and how that might affect the Assassin's Creed, because I am a diehard Assassin's Creed fan. So for the longest time we were asking Ubisoft for like a Japanese type of setting, and the fact that this might be the killing blow to Ubisoft as a whole is kind of ironic in this sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's going private makes the most sense, but yeah, it would be sad. It would be disappointing is probably a better word to say, that if Assassin's Creed's finally starting to move back towards what we want, it might not be the historical setting that we want, but they're moving back to original story, different characters, going in back to that direction. But they will have done twice. They'll have launched a game that's very similar to a PlayStation game, or similar words or similar names or whatever it is to a PlayStation first-party game within 6 months of PlayStation launching. Because Valhalla came out within 6 months of Ragnarok, and very similar tones, very similar lore, in that respect, just on face value, let alone when you get into the game itself. But yeah, they've got to rely on, unfortunately, they've got to rely on these titles to maintain the cash flow. But it would be very disappointing if they delayed it again and then it got belted over the head by the Ghost of Yotei. The flip side is they're pushing really hard to have it on Steam day and date of launch, so they've learned a lesson there at least.
And they're also reducing the prices too of their premium editions, thankfully.
They are. And they're pushing hard to get Star Wars Outlaws. Was that the recent one?
Yeah, but I don't think that's going to recover, to be honest.
Well, they're pushing hard to get the PC launch done, and if I know the PS5 Pro version is horrible. They just need to get better at making things polished when they get out. Because the game itself, from what I've seen and what I've played limited amount of, not a horrible game. It's just performs like garbage.
Yeah.
And they need to be better at it. And look, if they need to not go to console and just put a game on PC only, well, so be it. But you can't keep wheeling out half-baked rubbish to hit it. And again, this is the benefits of going private. If you've got commitments to shareholders and commitments to investors that this game will be out in this time because we have to hit these earnings potentials and all the rest of it, it just pushes garbage out the door. If they don't have that pressure, they can say, we're not going to tell you when it's going to release. It'll be sometime in 2025, but it'll be polished and it will work great when we get it out. Because we don't have to rush it out the door. So, again, positives. But yeah, we'll see. Anyway, you wanted to finish on that point, so.
Yeah. So thank you everybody for coming to this very late episode. Sorry it took a while. Again, sports got in the way and also technical difficulties. But yeah. And just to give you guys some updates, I will be doing a live stream on this Sunday, just to kind of give you some some updates about what I'm going to be doing for this next month, because I am going to be out of town in like 2 weeks. So yeah. And yeah, but I hope you guys do enjoy this, and I will be back for the Game Awards doing my own personal reaction stream, and I am going to be hosting a Game Awards episode with Flam and Loke for my Unplugged Opinions, so stay tuned for that. That's going to be a very fun episode to do. Yeah, so yeah, but with that, guys, enjoy the rest of your weekend, and peace.